All right. Welcome, everyone, to the finals of the 14th annual Tulane International Baseball Arbitration Competition. My name's Cody Dunlap. Along with the other members of our board here at Tulane, we are very excited to bring you the conclusion of this year's competition. Just a brief note at first, to anyone who is not a competitor, a judge, or our bailiff, please make sure to mute your sound. Please make sure to mute your microphone and turn off your video. This is done so the competitors and the judges can keep track of who's who and who they are presenting for. A big thank you to all those judges and competitors as well. We appreciate everyone who is here to view the finals, but we appreciate everyone who has participated, and of course, to our judges who have given their time and efforts to keep this competition going through these uncertain times. We are very thankful for everyone that we have been able to keep this competition going this year, and hopefully next year we will be back in person here in New Orleans. Today's championship match is between team number 16 and team number 4. And team number 16 represents St. John's, with team number 4 representing the University of Texas. And this case will be between Walker Buehler and the Los Angeles Dodgers. Team 16, St. John's, will be representing Walker Buehler. And team number 4, University of Texas, will be representing the Dodgers. Before we dive into the rules, Jared will give a little bit of an introduction on some of our judges, for those who might not know some of the individuals that are present here. Jared, are you ready for that?
Sure, yeah. So I'm sure you've met all of the judges throughout the weekend, but again, I'd like to extend our gratitude as a board and as a competition for these judges taking the time and effort to work with us throughout this competition. So I would like to introduce first Mr. Mark Feinstein. Mr. Feinstein is an executive reporter and MLB Network insider. He's written 2 books, including Mission 27, which chronicled the Yankees' 2009 World Series season. You can follow him on Twitter at Feinstein, where he's broken stories such as Josh Donaldson's recent deal with the Twins and the finalization of Shohei Ohtani's posting agreement. We'd also like to introduce Mr. Jay Reisinger. Mr. Reisinger is a partner at Farrell and Reisinger LLC in Pittsburgh. His sports law practice includes the representation of athletes and agents in the MLB, NFL, NHL, and the NBA in salary arbitration proceedings, contract analysis, and negotiation strategy. He's also a successful criminal and civil. He also has a successful criminal and civil practice where he advises a number of sports agencies in every professional sport. I'd also like to introduce Mr. Mark Fedorov. John Fedorov, excuse me. Mr. Fedorov. John Fedorov. John Fedorov is the head of Zuckerman Bader Sports. He has been a certified agent since 2007, and his clients include all-stars, Zion caliber pitchers, and first-round selections. He's run arbitration hearings with players on the Angels, Marlins, and Nationals just within the last 2 seasons. He is also representing his clients in front of congressional committees as well as civil litigation matters. Also like to introduce Mr. Matt Klein. Mr. Klein is the Vice President of Baseball Operations for the Milwaukee Brewers. He joined the Brewers as an associate scout in 2007 and has worked his way up the ladder. He oversees roster construction, player evaluation, and contract negotiations. Mr. Klein also led the salary arbitration process and is responsible for the team's procedural compliance. During his time with the Brewers, the team has won 2 NL Central Division titles and clinched a wild card berth. Next, we have Ms. Caroline Perry. Ms. Perry is the Senior Vice President General Counsel of the San Diego Padres. Mrs. Perry oversees the Padres' legal risk and management areas. She has been involved in numerous large-scale projects for the Padres, including negotiations with the City of San Diego surrounding the 2016 MLB All-Star Game and the management of Petco Park, as well as the extension of the Padres spring training lease and the sale of the team to the current ownership group back in 2012. We also have Greg McMillan. Mr. McMillan is the current Assistant Director of International Scouting for the Cincinnati Reds. His baseball operations career has included stops in minor league baseball, Houston, Tampa, and the Office of the Commissioner, and Philadelphia. Most importantly, Mr. McMillan is a former Tulane International Baseball Arbitration Competition champion. We also have Brian Grieper. Mr. Grieper is an attorney agent with Paragon Sports. He's represented over 200 professional ball players, including World Series champion Mike Napoli. Mr. Grieper has negotiated and crafted contracts with MLB teams from drafted players, rookies, and veterans, and represented his players throughout the arbitration process. Next, we have Greg Dreyfus. Mr. Dreyfus is the Director of Analytics and Baseball Operations for the MLBPA. In 2009, he was recognized in the Athletics 35 under 35 for his work preparing hundreds of pages of material for the league's arbitration hearings. Mr. Dreyfus also assists with the league's collective bargaining agreement. He also gets a special shout out from us for helping us come up with this year's unique format using players from previous years. He also helped us select the players as well as their proposed salaries. He is also a former Tulane International Baseball Arbitration Competition champion, which he won in 2013. I'd also like to introduce Trey Hendricks, who is the Director of International Scouting at the Cincinnati Reds. He has also had a wide-ranging career in Major League Baseball. He started as a minor league player with the Arizona Diamondbacks. He also has worked with the Washington Nationals, Cleveland Indians, Texas Rangers, and now with the Reds, and we're happy to have him. And last but not least, Mr. Michael Mariano, who is the Vice President of Baseball Operations at Washington. And yeah, we're happy to have everyone. Thank you so much for thank you so much for coming.
Thank you, Jarrett, for running through everyone's career accomplishments. We're happy to have all of our judges here, and thank you.
Sorry, Michael, I didn't know you were last minute. I didn't know you were coming.
That's okay. I want Cody to give my bio. He still owes me a little bit from last year.
Michael, I'll always owe you. That debt's not going to be repaid anytime soon. But we don't have time to get into that right now. That would take too long. So without further ado, let's turn it over to Sharon DePrinzio, our bailiff, and she will be reading the rules and getting things started.
Thank you, Cody. So for the participants, the rules are as follows. The TIBAC committee retains the right to make the ultimate ruling on all matters not mentioned in this statement per section 13 of the rule book. All competitors must keep their cameras on and microphones unmuted throughout the duration of the hearing. Participants, including coaches, are prohibited from using mobile devices, tablets, or other external electronic devices during the competition. Coaches are permitted to enter the hearing room but must turn their cameras off and remain muted throughout the duration of the hearing. All participants' names as they appear on each participant's screen must conform to the following format based on the side each team represents during the hearing. Team number, MLB player name, competitor name. Team number, MLB team name, competitor name. The chat function of Zoom will be disabled as between participants. Competitors are not permitted to communicate with one another, their coaches, or any non-participants during the hearing. Notwithstanding the foregoing, during the 2-minute recess, the competitors may communicate with one another within their breakout room, though not with their coaches or any non-participants. Upon request to the bailiff prior to the team's opening statement and/or rebuttal during the presentations, any competitor on the team, though not a coach, will be permitted to share their screen, meaning the competitor who shares their screen need not be the person speaking. And if a team prefers to exchange rebuttal slides, if any, through the chat feature, and this is acceptable to the arbitrators, the bailiff will permit the team to do so. The bailiff will send time remaining notifications to the participants through the chat function as follows. Opening statements, 7 minutes, 3 minutes, and 1 minute remaining. Rebuttals, 3 minutes and 1 minute remaining. 2 team members must participate in each arbitration hearing, but may divide the team allocated as they wish. If a team has 3 members, each member must participate in at least 1 arbitration hearing each day. During opening remarks, teams may not use comparable player salaries not included in their exhibits submitted electronically. Oral arguments will only reference information available with respect to the Buehler case, December 1st, 2020. Any information, including but not limited to comparable player salaries, published or made known after the above referenced dates are inadmissible. Section 6E10 A through C of the 2017 to 2021 Basic Agreement governs the scope of permissible information. If a team acts in violation of sections 10, 11, 12, or 13 above, or if they provide information that is found to be factually incorrect, the opposing team must object to the arbitrator immediately. No objections will be allowed once the hearing has concluded. A maximum of 2 coaches per team may join each hearing. Coaches may not make objections or interrupt the proceedings in any way. The round will last 47 minutes. The format will be as follows. Player side opening statement, 15 minutes. Club side opening statement, 15 minutes. Recess, 2 minutes. Player side rebuttal, 7.5 minutes. Club side rebuttal, 7.5 minutes. The aforementioned time constraints are inclusive of any questions posed by arbitrators. A team may ask for additional time to respond to a question prior to time expiring. The arbitrator, at his or her discretion, may grant such a request. Are there any questions from the competitors? Seeing none, we'll proceed if the player side is prepared to share their screen.
Everybody see this and hear me okay? Members of the panel, my name is Alex Evlovich, and along with my co-counselor, John Gilroy, I will be representing MLB All-Star Walker Buehler in this arbitration against the Los Angeles Dodgers today. Mr. Buehler is requesting a player salary of $4.3 million, while the Dodgers have offered $3.2 million. This creates an arbitration midpoint of $3.75 million. As we will demonstrate today, Mr. Buehler is worth his player request of $4.3 million. Here is a table of contents for your reference, as well as the arbitration criteria for your reference. Here's Mr. Buehler's background. Notably, he was drafted in the first round in 2015, and he made his debut in 2017 at the age of 22. Here's his prior compensation for your reference, as well as the transaction history. Mr. Buehler has 2.17 years of service and is a Super 2 first-time arbitration eligible player. Mr. Buehler, who was called up at 22 and his platform year -3, pitched exclusively out of the bullpen in that year, not in his natural position as a starting pitcher. In 2018, his platform year -2, he is in his natural position as a starter, and as you can see, he has improved year on year since then. He has even improved into the COVID-shortened 2020 season, and Mr. Buehler has become one of the best and most consistent starters for the Dodgers. Moreover, Mr. Buehler is improving in the statistical categories that drive the starting pitching market. These are the categories you see when a player is brought into a baseball game, or when you flip over a baseball card: ERA, WHIP, wins, losses, and strikeouts. Additionally, those categories are the categories that lead to awards and recognition, which eventually leads to fans in the seats, hopefully for 2021, which is why he is worth his ask of $4.3 million. So we're going to begin by looking at his platform year -2. And again, he's in his normal position as a starter. He has a very stellar season and finishes 3rd place in Rookie of the Year voting behind Mr. Juan Soto and Mr. Ronald Acuna. He improves in innings pitched, games started, quality starts, and he decreases his ERA and WHIP. Most impressive, at the young age of 23, he's in the top 10 in MLB amongst players with at least 130 innings pitched in WHIP and ERA. There are some notable names that he's behind in WHIP, such as Mr. Chris Sale, Mr. Justin Verlander, Mr. Max Scherzer, and Mr. Jacob deGrom, and he's even ahead of some very well-respected pitchers like Mr. Corey Kluber, Mr. Garrett Cole, and Mr. Clayton Kershaw. And that season marks the first of Mr. Buehler's extensive postseason experience. If you look at the inning pitch column on slide 10, you'll see that he has 23.2 innings pitched in this postseason. And a trend begins to emerge in his career that as the games mean more, Mr. Buehler is at his best. If you look at the ERA column, you can see as you go down, he gets better, which culminates in a World Series start in which he has 7 innings pitched and 0 runs given up. Another trend that emerges is that the Dodgers use Mr. Buehler in the most important situations. In the NLCS, Game 7 against the Brewers, loser goes home. Mr. Buehler gets the start. He has 1 earned run and 7 strikeouts. K-9 over 15, the Dodgers win and go to the World Series. So now we're going to take a look at his platform year -1, which is the season in which he sets career highs in innings pitched, wins, quality starts, and he has a win-loss percentage of 78%, or 780. He only has 4 losses in the entire regular season across 30 starts, and he is heavily recognized for his achievements. He's an all-star this year, and he gets Cy Young consideration. Additionally, he finishes in the top 10 in Major League Baseball and all those assorted stats that are in that chart on the bottom left. Notably, he's in 1st in complete games, 1st in win-loss percentage. His postseason dominance continues into 2019 platform year -1. He has 12.2 postseason innings pitched in the NLDS and a .71 ERA. Again, the Dodgers use him in the closeout game of the NLDS, which is Game 5. He has 6.2 innings pitched, 1 earned run, and 7 strikeouts. He leaves the game with a 3-1 lead, but unfortunately the Dodgers are unable to hold on to that lead. So now we get into COVID-19 shortened season, where MLB shortens the season from 162 to 60 games. There's many complications, difficulties that come along with that, notably abiding by COVID protocols, quarantining, player and family safety. The end result is that Mr. Buehler has 8 starts and 36.2 innings pitched. While those look like low numbers on the surface,
it's notable that he's tied for the second most starts on the Dodgers, and he is not off the pace he would have had the pandemic never occurred. We show this by looking at the stats two different ways. I didn't want to crowd this slide with too much math because I know we're all ball players and attorneys here, but we do a prorated look where we take the first 60 games and extrapolate it over 162, and we do a ratio-based look. That takes his whole career averages and extrapolates it as if he played an additional 102 games. Admittedly, these looks are not perfect, but this is an unprecedented event. I'm not sure there's a better way to visualize it. We give it to the panel to consider, but we're going to argue on what did happen in 2020. Every team had to deal with the same thing. In a year that many players opted out of baseball, Mr. COVID opted in, abided by all COVID protocols, and he set a new career low in WHIP at 9.55. He also maintained his strong ERA at 3.44, and he had 0 losses in the entire regular season. That success continues into the postseason, where the Dodgers end up winning the World Series. Despite all the troubles of 2020, when it came the time that mattered the most, the Dodgers called on Mr. Buehler. Mr. Buehler performed, and the team won the World Series. I'll have you look at his World Series ERA of 1.5 and that whole ERA column that culminates in a total of a 1.8 ERA for the entire postseason. He also has 11 innings pitched in the NLCS and 6 in the World Series. All in all, he has the fourth most postseason innings pitched in all of baseball with 25 and the second most postseason strikeouts. In fact, his postseason K through 9 of 14.04 is the 3rd highest for any season of all time, behind Mr. Garrett Cole and Mr. Chris Sale. It's a record-setting performance. And if you look at the innings pitched on slide 14, the column on the right of the lower chart, he has the broadest sample size. So in summary, he's a regular season pitcher with a 3.15 ERA, a 1.028 WHIP, and a win-loss percentage of .730. That's an all-star who gets Rookie of the Year and Cy Young consideration. He's the guy the Dodgers turn to in big spots, and the Dodgers team success is incredibly linked to his performance. I'll have you note he has 9 losses in his entire 4-year career. In his platform year, he didn't have a single loss, including the postseason and the World Series, and he's improving year on year. We provide this table on the bottom just to give you a visual look of seasons of certain accomplishments. Each baseball represents a certain accomplishment, for example, complete games. And we're going to come back to that later for our comps. Now, when we look at the postseason, we see that Mr. Buehler has an absurdly high 15% of his career innings in the postseason. He's better as the games mean more. I ask you again to look at that ERA column that ends in a .69. And his total postseason K through 9 of 12.18 is the 7th best of all time. I'll also have you note he has the most innings pitched on that list at the young age of 25. So now we're get into some comparable players. And we're going to look at Mr. Luis Severino, Mr. Jacob deGrom, and Mr. Trevor Bauer. The blue line indicates the arbitration midpoint of $3.75 million, which is somewhere between Jacob deGrom and Trevor Bauer, a little closer to Mr. Bauer. So Mr. Severino has a salary of $4.825 million after arbitration. And I'll have you look at, on his chart, Severino's chart, the one in the middle. In the loss column, you'll see he has 8 losses in 2 different seasons. I'll have you note that Mr. Buehler has 9 losses in his entire career. You see the 2 years with a lot of red, those are years of regression. In 2016, Mr. Severino has 11 starts, an 0-8 record, and an 8.50 ERA, and he's moved to the bullpen by the Yankees. Mr. Buehler never regresses so drastically in any season. As you'll see, even when he dips a little bit in certain years, he's still very consistent. And I'll also have you note that Mr. Buehler has 2 years with a sub-1.0 WHIP, while Mr. Severino never achieves that benchmark. We look at the PY-1 for the last complete season that Mr. Buehler has pitched because of the shortened season. And you see that Mr. Severino and Mr. Buehler overlap in a lot of categories. They're very similar pitchers. For the platform year, because they played different number of games, we looked only at the quality stats. And we also see that they're very similar, with Buehler getting the edge in certain areas. So now we turn to the postseason, and I'll have you look at the innings pitched column for Mr. Severino and the ERA, and you'll see that inconsistency continues into the postseason. And additionally, as the games mean more, Mr. Severino does not improve like Mr. Buehler. Also, the team success is not there, as Mr. Buehler's team makes the World Series twice and he wins one, and Mr. Severino never makes it to the World Series. So we take the summary chart again with the baseballs, and as you can see, in all, it ends up with Mr. Buehler having 19 baseballs in the regular season compared to 16 for Severino and 19 to 6 in the playoffs. But we pay particular attention to the recognition and awards, which we've identified as a market driver. And we see that Mr. Severino has 4 to Mr. Buehler's 3. Mr. Severino has more awards, and he has a very high salary of $4.825 million. We haven't accomplished that yet, but we are very, very close, and we are asking for $4.3 million. Now we're going to take a look at Mr. DeGrom, who has a $4.05 million salary after arbitration. Again, I'll have you look. He has 8 losses in 2 seasons. We have 9 for our whole career, Mr. Buehler. Additionally, in his platform year, he has a losing record. Like Mr. Buehler, in years where they regress, the regression isn't that bad. For instance, Mr. DeGrom goes from a 2.54 to a 3.04. Mr. Buehler goes from a 2.62 to a 3.26. These are great players. And while Mr. DeGrom gets the Rookie of the Year, Mr. Buehler finishes in 3rd. But if you see the chart on the bottom on slide 26, he arguably has a better season. And in the postseason, I'll have you please look at Mr. DeGrom's chart on the right. You'll see in the World Series, he has an ERA of 7.2. We go back to this look, and we see that it's 19 to 14 in the regular season in terms of these categories, 19 to 10 in the postseason, but significantly, the recognition and awards is very similar. And now we look at Mr. Trevor Bauer, and Mr. Trevor Bauer is not at all like Mr. Buehler. You can see that Mr. Bauer never has a year with an ERA less than 4.18. He never has a sub-1 whip or a K through 9 over 10. In fact, overall, he's a losing pitcher. And in the postseason, he's not a great pitcher either. In the 2016 ALCS, he fails to get out of the first inning in his start, and he takes 2 losses in the World Series in the 2016 World Series. As you can see, as the lights get brighter, Mr. Bauer is not at his best. So we turn to the baseball chart again, and we see the comparisons again. Notably, there's no All-Star, no Cy Young, or no Rookie of the Year consideration for Bauer. And so now, when we look at everything, some highlights are that Mr. Buehler has the lowest whip, the least losses. He has an ERA between Mr. DeGrom and Mr. Severino. He also has the least games played, and he's had to deal with the COVID pandemic. When we look at the postseason, Mr. Buehler dominates the field. He has the same amount of postseason innings pitched as the entire field, and he has more quality starts than the entire field, with the lowest ERA and the lowest whip. As you can see, his regular season stats are in line with Mr. Severino and Mr. DeGrom, which is why we are requesting to be paid between the two. And the awards and recognition cements that position. When we look at the postseason, it really cements that position because Mr. Buehler is the most decorated pitcher and the most successful postseason pitcher among all the comps. And he ends with a World Series in his platform year. Accordingly, Mr. Buehler is worth his player request of $4.3 million between the salaries of Mr. Severino and Mr. DeGrom. That salary request is reasonable, and he is not trying to set a new market or a record for any starting pitchers. If he is not worth that $4.3 million, he is certainly worth the $3.75 million, which is less than DeGrom, but only $200,000 more than Mr. Bauer, who he outperforms across the board. He's certainly worth that. Accordingly, we ask that you award Mr. Buehler a salary of $4.3 million for the 2021 season. We thank you for your time.
Thank you, Team 16. Team 4, if you're prepared, please share your exhibits. And you may begin when you're ready.
Good afternoon, members of the panel. My name is Taylor Hinojosa, and along with my co-counsel, Brian Hammerschlag, we represent the Los Angeles Dodgers in this arbitration proceeding. First, we'd like to thank the members of the panel and counsel for Mr. Buehler for their time today. We're here to determine the salary Mr. Buehler will receive for the 2021 Major League Baseball season. Under the collective bargaining agreement, the Dodgers have filed a salary, and Mr. Buehler has filed a salary of what they believe is fair for the coming year. The Dodgers submitted a salary of $3.2 million, while Mr. Buehler filed at $4.3 million, leaving us with a midpoint of 3.75. What this process boils down to is that if this panel determines that Mr. Buehler's value is a single dollar below that midpoint, it must award the club's filed salary of $3.2 million and vice versa. Now, the CBA lays out 6 separate factors to be considered when making salary determinations. First is Mr. Buehler's contributions in the previous season. Second are his career contributions. Third, his past compensation. Fourth, the comparative salaries of other Major League Baseball players with a particular focus on players in the same annual service group as Mr. Buehler. Fifth is the existence of any physical or mental defects on behalf of Mr. Buehler. And 6 is the recent performance of the Los Angeles Dodgers. Now, we'd like to note that performance in the previous season, what we will be referring to as the platform year, is listed separately and first among the factors to be considered. Historically, it is performance in the platform year that is the main driver of salaries for starting pitchers entering their first year of arbitration eligibility, or what we will be referring to as FYAE seasons. Now, Mr. Buehler falls within a special subset of FYAE players known as Super 2 players. All this means is that he qualifies for arbitration a year before the majority of his peers who will otherwise be paid the league minimum salary in the coming year. As mentioned by Mr. Buehler's counsel, Mr. Buehler's platform year was in 2020. And Major League Baseball, like all other industries, was extremely disrupted by the COVID-19 pandemic, playing a shortened 60-game season. To account for this, we have extrapolated Mr. Buehler's 60-game counting statistics to an expected performance over a 162-game season, and we will be referring to these as his 2020 X stats as opposed to his 2020 actual stats. It is a position of the Los Angeles Dodgers that Mr. Buehler falls below the midpoint for 3 reasons. First, Mr. Buehler had a lackluster performance in his platform year and regressed significantly from his career trends, even when accounting for the shortened season. Second, Mr. Buehler falls far short of the elite company of Jacob deGrom, who is the only Super 2 starting pitcher since 2015 to receive a salary above the midpoint in our case. Finally, while Mr. Buehler's playoff performance is greatly appreciated by the Dodgers, historical precedent shows that playoff performance is not something that's given significant weight in the arbitration process. Now, as mentioned, the first consideration for salary determinations is platform year performance. Here are Mr. Buehler's platform statistics in actual and extrapolated forms. As you can see, Mr. Buehler did not contribute to much winning to the Dodgers in the regular season. He had only 1 win in 2020, and this would have projected to just 3 wins throughout the course of a traditional regular season. This was driven mainly by the fact that Mr. Buehler pitched very few innings in his platform year. He missed multiple weeks on the injured list, and even when he was available, he had early exits in many of his starts. In fact, in his 8 starts, he averaged only 4 2/3 innings per outing. In all, he pitched only 36 2/3 innings, and this would have projected to just 99 innings in a full season. So why does this 99 number matter? Because since 2015, no FYAE starting pitcher has thrown under 100 innings in a platform year and earned above the $3.75 million midpoint, let alone even come close. While Mr. Buehler struggled to add value in the 2020 regular season, This was not the case for other Dodgers starters who made as many starts as Mr. Buehler. As you can see, Mr. Buehler actually ranked dead last among these starters in key stats such as wins, earned run average, strikeouts, and home runs per 9 innings. After platform year, this panel may also consider Mr. Buehler's career performance. However, of course, the 2020 season threw a wrench into this analysis as well. And obviously, while this is unprecedented, we've provided Mr. Buehler's career stats here in both their actual and extrapolated forms. Career wins historically have been a key determinant for FYAE pitcher salaries. Since 2015, there is only one pitcher who has had as few wins as Mr. Buehler and received a salary above our $3.75 million midpoint. However, that pitcher was Matt Harvey, who had an outstanding career ERA entering arbitration of 2.53, which was far below Mr. Buehler's 3.15. The third factor to be considered is the salaries of players with comparable platform and career performances. 3 players that we believe provide a nice range in which to fit Mr. Buehler's salary are Lance McCullers, Noah Syndergaard, and Jacob deGrom. However, we believe that the only 2 true comparisons are to Lance McCullers and Mr. Syndergaard. Mr. McCullers earned a salary of $2.45 million in his FYAE season, and Mr. Syndergaard earned a salary of $3 million. Both of these numbers are far below the midpoint in our case. Given inflation in the market, we believe a slight raise from Mr. Syndergaard's $3 million up to $3.2 million is warranted for Mr. Buehler, but it is clear that Mr. Buehler falls far short of Jacob deGrom, who's again the only Super 2 pitcher to breach our midpoint in the last 5 years. So Lance McCullers signed a $2.45 million salary as a Super 2 pitcher, and he provides a nice floor against which to assess Mr. Buehler. These two had very similar platform years. They put together comparable regular season statistics, and both had successful playoff performances for the eventual World Series champions in their platform season. As seen here, Mr. Buehler may have been slightly more effective in terms of rate stats, but Mr. McCullers outperformed Mr. Buehler's extrapolated counting stats like wins, quality starts, and strikeouts, which are key drivers of FYAE salaries. Much of Mr. Buehler's argument was based on his success in the playoffs. And again, while the Dodgers greatly appreciate that performance, we believe it's significant that Mr. Buehler and Mr. McCullers had similar playoff performances for the eventual World Series champion in their platform year. The fact that Mr. McCullers received so far below the midpoint indicates that playoff performance is not among the most important factors for FYAE pitcher salaries. Here are some key comparisons that throughout their career that underline their similarities. Mr. Buehler has recorded 5 more wins, gives up only a half a run less, and strikes out batters at roughly the same rate. But altogether, according to WAR, or wins above replacement, which aims to capture the overall value in terms of wins added as compared to a league average starting pitcher, Mr. Buehler was worth only 1 more win than Mr. McCullers. In the end, Mr. McCullers received that $2.45 million salary. While we recognize that Mr. Buehler's numbers edge out those of Mr. McCullers slightly, the gap is not so large as to justify a more than 50% raise over Mr. McCullers' salary. As such, we believe a $3.2 million raise, or $3.2 million salary, that is warranted. The other true comparison for Mr. Buehler is Noah Syndergaard, who received a salary of $3 million in his Super 2 season. Given their similarities in their career and platform performances and natural inflation in the market, we believe that a $3.2 million salary is more than fair for Mr. Buehler. In Mr. Syndergaard's limited time in his platform year, he was a much more effective pitcher than Mr. Buehler. He had a platform ERA of 2.97, walked less than a batter per 9 innings, and gave up 0 home runs across all of his starts. These numbers paint a picture of a pitcher that gives up fewer runs, has greater command over his pitches, and avoids critical mistakes more often than Mr. Buehler does. The same trend can be seen in their career numbers as well. They have the same number of wins and strikeouts per 9 innings, but Mr. Syndergaard again has a significantly lower ERA and significantly more quality starts. While they strike out batters at roughly the same rate, Mr. Syndergaard again has much better command. He walks fewer batters per 9 innings, and he gives up far fewer home runs per 9 innings. In the end, Mr. Buehler and Mr. Syndergaard put together remarkably similar careers leading up to their FYAE season. Again, we believe it's notable that Mr. Syndergaard was also a superb playoff performer leading into arbitration, just like Mr. Buehler. They both have sub 2.5 playoff ERAs and each won a World Series game for their team. All things considered, Mr. Syndergaard's $3 million salary is exactly where Mr. Buehler falls, but we recognize that a slight raise to adjust for inflation is warranted. As such, we believe that raise ought to be $200,000 up to the $3.2 million filing. Our third and final comparison illustrates why it is that Mr. Buehler falls so far short of the $3.75 million midpoint. In 2017, Jacob deGrom received a salary of $4.1 million, making him the only Super 2 player since 2015 to receive a salary in excess of our midpoint. This makes sense when considering that Mr. deGrom's platform and career statistics exceed Mr. Buehler's in almost every way. In his platform year, Mr. deGrom pitched more innings. He had more wins and had 4 times the number of quality starts as Mr. Buehler when accounting for the shortened season. Altogether, WAR valued Mr. deGrom as over 4 times as valuable as Mr. Buehler in their platform year. When looking at their careers, though, it's clear that Mr. deGrom's outperformance in the platform year is not an aberration. Throughout his career, he has more innings pitched, more wins, more quality starts, and a lower ERA. He also walks fewer batters per 9 and gives up fewer home runs. Ultimately, according to WAR, Mr. deGrom is worth 5.8 wins more than Mr. Buehler. And that essentially doubles Mr. Buehler's value throughout his career entering arbitration. These statistics belay why Mr. Buehler's value falls far short of that of Mr. deGrom. And further, they illustrate why a corresponding gap in their salaries is justified. Mr. deGrom earned above the midpoint in this case, but it was only by around $300,000. The statistical dominance that he's achieved over Mr. Buehler is worth certainly more than that, especially when considering the state of their respective trophy cases. Mr. deGrom won Rookie of the Year and has had a higher Cy Young finish than Mr. Buehler, who merely placed 3rd in Rookie of the Year voting in his rookie year. In the end, a clear trend can be seen when comparing Mr. Buehler with the 3 most relevant FYAE pitchers, that is. What we have seen is that Mr. Buehler's platform year is most comparable to Mr. Mccullers, and that his career numbers are most comparable to Mr. Syndergaard's. Both of these pitchers received salaries below the ones filed by the Dodgers, let alone the midpoint in our case. That Mr. Buehler falls below the midpoint is further illustrated by the wide gap between he and Mr. deGrom, who once again is the only Super 2 pitcher in the last 5 years to breach our midpoint. For these reasons, we believe a fair value for Mr. Buehler's services for the coming season falls below that $3.75 million midpoint. As such, we respectfully ask that this panel award the club's filed salary of $3.2 million. If there are no questions from the panel, we yield the remainder of our time.
Thank you, Team 4. Cody will now place the teams into their respective breakout rooms for a 2-minute recess. Okay, if Team 16 is ready to present their rebuttal, you may share your screen. And begin when you're ready.
You can see this and hear me, right?
Yes, we can.
Thank you. Good afternoon. I'd just like to thank the panel as well as our co-counsel and opposing counsel for appearing here today. What we have here is a salary arbitration between Walker Buehler and the Los Angeles Dodgers. Walker seeks to be paid above the midpoint of $3.75 million. Within this market, it's fairly crowded with a lot of players, some of which neither our side nor the other side has brought up today. We're left here with the comparables we have used, which are fair players. We don't deny that Lance Mccullers and Noah Syndergaard have a case to be made to compare to Walker Buehler. But I'd like to show you that these comparable players are not the ideal fit to compare to Mr. Buehler. Instead, I believe our comparable players are better suited to compare to Mr. Buehler. The first is Lance Mccullers. His first year eligibility salary was $750,000 below the midpoint. You see that Mr. Buehler is significantly better than Mr. McCullers, despite 2020. We see key comparisons from the other side. Their key comparisons, which seem to be a bit cherry-picked, ultimately show that Mr. Buehler was better than Mr. McCuller over their careers. I went looking for some other key comparisons and other statistics that were omitted here and found much of the same. Mr. Buehler is far better than Mr. McCullers. The postseason performance, our friends on the other side tell us, is similar. I really don't think that a 2.61 ERA and a 1.8 ERA are all that similar. Mr. Buehler dominates the postseason. The next player is Mr. Noah Syndergaard. He received a salary in his first year, $200,000 less than the club filing. We see that Mr. Buehler costs his team less games. They have similar statistics, but it's eye-catching that Mr. Buehler has only lost 9 games in his entire career. Mr. Syndergaard has lost 18. Looking at the postseason as well, we see that they've had fairly similar postseasons, although Mr. Buehler has a significant ERA advantage. However, we look at the World Series. See, Mr. Syndergaard struggled in his one start. Mr. Buehler got 2, and he was dominant. He won the Dodgers the World Series. The platform year injury issues are also not comparable, and we believe this is why Mr. Syndergaard did not receive a salary that was in line with what Mr. Buehler is requesting. Mr. Buehler was hurt during the platform year. We can't deny it. It happened. I pulled these statistics from MLB.com. They are real. He had a blister on his hand, something that healed quickly. Mr. Buehler returned, pitched in the playoffs. He pitched in the World Series and helped the Dodgers win. And as I showed you on the previous slide, he was really good when he did it. On the other hand, Mr. Syndergaard went down for a significant portion of his platform year. You see, it was 26 days compared to 145. Mr. Syndergaard started 7 games in his platform year and was really injured. He did come back and show that he was healthy and ready to go. However, we believe this is what set Mr. Syndergaard back, not what pulls Mr. Buehler back. As I mentioned, Walker Buehler returned to win the World Series. Mr. Syndergaard did not win the World Series. We also look at Mr. Jacob deGrom, whose first year of eligibility salary was between our midpoint and our player asking. What we see is that both players have had actually fairly similar careers. Mr. deGrom did win the Rookie of the Year, but if you compare the Rookie of the Years, Mr. Buehler tends to have the edge. Mr. Buehler also generally progresses throughout his career. On the other hand, Mr. deGrom regresses going into his platform year. This regression may hold Mr. deGrom back. Because of this similarity, we believe that the two players should be compensated very similarly, above the midpoint. We look at Mr. Trevor Bauer, whose salary is just slightly below the midpoint in this case. But you see that Mr. Buehler is significantly better than Mr. Bauer. He progresses throughout his career, while Mr. Bauer is inconsistent and struggles a fair amount in his career. We see that not only is Mr. Buehler better than Mr. Bauer, but he's certainly more than $200,000 better, which puts him above our midpoint. We also look at their playoffs. Mr. Buehler, I'll continue with it, was dominant in the postseason. While our opposing counsel tells you that the postseason is not that big a deal, it's not considered all that much, the postseason is what matters most. The regular season doesn't exist if it wasn't for a postseason. Sure, the regular season exists for revenue, but there's a reason why we have the regular season, and it's the postseason, because we want to determine a champion. When the Dodgers are looking to be that champion, Mr. Buehler contributes. Mr. Bauer, for the Cleveland Indians, doesn't do it so much. This sets Mr. Buehler ahead of Mr. Bauer. I'll conclude and just reiterate Mr. Buehler's case in chief. He progresses throughout his career, has some slight regression going into the platform year, but he's still good. In this COVID-shortened season, in difficult circumstances, Mr. Buehler impresses. He provides for the Dodgers. You see that once again, and you see his individual seasons of contribution. Year after year, Mr. Buehler gives the Dodgers what they need, a star pitcher. You see his league rankings in the playoffs and his playoff stats. He dominates there as well. You look at individual seasons of contribution and look at these baseball looks, you see that the market incorporates Mr. Buehler into his player ask. You see this as well with awards and recognition. Well, we're asking the panel to award Mr. Buehler a salary that is fair based on his achievements throughout his career. We've demonstrated to you that Mr. Buehler is able to fit into this realm. He's not asking for a record. He's not asking for something off the board. Mr. Buehler is simply requesting to be paid in line with the comparable players. Thank you.
Thank you, Team 16. Team 4, if you're prepared, please share your slides. And you may begin when you're ready.
Thank you, members of the panel. My name is Brian Hammerschlag, and I will be conducting the rebuttal on behalf of the LA Dodgers. I want to go over 3 main points with you to conclude our argument. First and foremost, Mr. Buehler compared himself to 3 pitchers who received salaries near or above the midpoint in this case. But Mr. Buehler falls far short of each of these pitchers for the same primary reason. Bulk matters in arbitration. Each of Mr. Buehler's comparables pitched far more innings and had far more wins in their platform years and careers. And history shows us that this increased availability and winning performance is really important for arbitration salary purposes. Second, Mr. Buehler tried to downplay the injuries he battled in 2020, but the ailment that forced Mr. Buehler into 2 IL stints, blisters on his pitching hand, are particularly likely to be recurring. And third, we just want to reiterate that of the 5 comparable pitchers you've seen today, the only true comparisons are Mr. Mccullers and Mr. Syndergaard. These 2 pitchers line up best with Mr. Buehler's platform and career performance. And a salary in line with Mr. Mccullers and Mr. Syndergaard is warranted for Mr. Buehler. When we compare the platform years of Mr. Buehler and the 3 comparable players he threw out, the clear contrast is that each of these comparables were available every 5 days for their team and pitched deep into ball games, unlike Mr. Buehler. Even when accounting for the COVID-shortened season, each of Luis Severino, Trevor Bauer, and Jacob deGrom would have pitched far more innings than Mr. Buehler, with Mr. Severino and Mr. Bauer at essentially double the innings Mr. Buehler had in his platform year. And unsurprisingly, each of these comparables ended up with more wins in their platform year as well. While we certainly recognize Mr. Buehler was close or better in some rate stats than these pitchers, the fact of the matter is that bulk and availability in a platform season are the key platform statistics that determine FYAE salary. As we showed in our opening presentation, innings pitched in a platform season is a driver of FYAE salary. Pitchers with as few innings pitched as Mr. Buehler, who's represented by the red vertical line, struggle to exceed even $3 million, let alone the $3.75 million midpoint in our case. Now contrast this with Mr. Buehler's comparables, represented by the vertical lines on the far right side of this graph. Pitchers like Mr. deGrom, Mr. Bauer, and Mr. Severino, who each exceeded 145 innings pitched in their platform years, are the ones who tend to receive salaries above the midpoint in our case. They get rewarded for their availability and for taking the ball every 5 days. We also want to note here that Mr. Severino is not actually represented on this scatter plot. That's because he was not part of the arbitration system. Mr. Severino signed a multi-year contract with the Yankees, and thus his salary is not a great comparison to establish the arbitration market, which aims to determine player value in a single season based on their accomplishments up to that point. Now, the trend we just discussed also holds true with platform wins. Again, players with 3 wins or fewer in a platform year, like Mr. Buehler, struggle to breach the $3 million mark, let alone our midpoint. Each of Mr. Buehler's comparable players had more wins than him in their platform years. Mr. Bauer and Mr. Severino significantly so. And as Mr. DeGrom shows us, it's taken at least 6 to 7 platform wins to breach the midpoint. Mr. Buehler's win total in his platform year makes each of his comparables out of his salary range. Again, this trend also holds true when we look at Mr. Buehler and his comparable players' career stats. Even giving Mr. Buehler the benefit of the doubt and using his career stats with 2020 extrapolated numbers, his innings pitched total falls far below each of his comparables, and he has less career wins than every single one of them. Now, this lack of bulk on Mr. Buehler's part is really notable. If you recall back to the factors the panel may consider in arbitration, the length and consistency of a career is specifically enumerated in the CBA. Innings pitched is the best barometer of the overall length of a career, and as it shows how often a pitcher has taken the mound and has contributed to his team. Historical trends from the last 5 years demonstrate that career innings pitched is perhaps the key metric for measuring career length and consistency, and it tends to predict FYAE salary. As you can see, no one with as few career innings pitched as Mr. Buehler's 366, represented by the black vertical line, has even come within $300,000 of the midpoint dating back to 2015. Even when considering Mr. Buehler's 428 careers pitched using his 2020 X numbers, only one pitcher has breached the midpoint in this case, with so few innings. And that was the aforementioned Matt Harvey, who far outshines Mr. Buehler in other regards, like career ERA. The 3 vertical lines grouped at the far right of this graph show the 3 comparable players used by Mr. Buehler. The fact that the majority of the blue dots you see above the yellow horizontal line, which represents the midpoint in this case, are at the far right of the graph is no coincidence. High FYAE salaries are reserved for durable workhorse pitchers. Mr. Buehler's 3 comparables were that in their careers, while Mr. Buehler has not been. Some of the reason for this lack of bulk was the injuries Mr. Buehler dealt with during the past year. Mr. Buehler's recurring blister woes are particularly concerning to the Dodgers, given the tendency of blister injuries to repeat from year to year. Now, this all matters because one of the 6 factors to be considered by the panel is the existence of physical or mental defects. While we certainly admit Mr. Buehler has no mental defects, and he's been a consummate professional throughout his career, the blister issue could present problems for Mr. Buehler and the club in the future. We just want to end on one final note. Today, you've seen comparisons to 5 separate players with a range of salaries for comparative purposes. But of those players, Mr. Buehler's platform statistics were most similar to Lance Mccullers, whose $2.5 million salary was far below the midpoint in this case. The similarities between the two included successful playoff runs on the eventual World Series champion, which does not hold the kind of value that Mr. Buehler needs it to propel him over the midpoint in this case. And of those players, Mr. Buehler's career stats were most in line with Mr. Syndergaard, who earned $3 million in his Super 2 season. Both of Mr. Buehler's closest comparisons received salaries below the one filed by the Dodgers, let alone the $3.75 million midpoint. And Mr. Buehler's top comparison, Mr. Severino, whose salary is way out of whack with the rest of the players named today, is simply not a good measuring post for arbitration salary purposes. His multi-year deal distorts the reality of what he actually might have been worth in arbitration. Accordingly, we request that this panel grant Mr. Buehler the Dodgers filed salary of $3.2 million. And we just want to thank both Mr. Buehler's counsel and all the members of the panel for their time today. Thank you.
Thank you, Team 4. Cody will now place the arbitrators in a breakout room so that they may deliberate.
I feel like we're actually appreciating that.
Okay, welcome back, everyone. We will, the judges have reached a decision. We will announce now we'll announce all of the winners first. We will first for the written only competition. The winners are Team Lasorda of the University of Iowa, Thomas Hafen and Kelly Faree. Those are the winners of the written only competition. The Written Advocacy Award given to the team with the best written briefs. That goes to Team 8, the George Washington University Law School, Brennan Weiss, Suresh Rav, and their coach, David Johnson. Congratulations to them. The top oral advocate is Taylor Ambrosius of the Charleston School of Law. That was from team number 12. And then from the judges, the winner of the 2021 Tulane International Baseball Arbitration Competition is Team 16 from St. John's University. They represented Walker Buehler in the final case. Thank you to both teams and congratulations to both sides and congratulations to all of our competitors. We are going to send out the feedback, the scores. We'll be sending that out in the next couple of weeks. But thanks again to everyone. And that concludes this year's competition. We hope to see all of you back next year and your teams back next year for the 15th edition of the Tulane Baseball Arbitration Competition.
And we are handing it off to our 2L members. That will be Sharon DePrinzio, our esteemed bailiff for this round, Alicia McCain, and Maxwell Martin. They will be taking over the reins of the TBAC for the 15th annual. Congratulations, guys. We're very happy to hand it over to them. Judges, y'all are in great hands, as y'all know through all of these time and meetings. And thank once again to everybody for your participation.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys.